In this video, I want to look at how we use the GCF and the LCM with fractions. Let's start with a problem like simplify the fraction 24 over 36. So I want to put this in simplest terms. Well, I may be able to say, well, the top and the bottom have a 12 in common, so I can divide by 12. And that gives me 2/3. Well, what this 12 is it is the greatest common factor of 24 and 36. So if I know the greatest common factor between the numerator and the denominator, I can easily simplify these fractions. It is not necessary to determine the greatest common factor of the numerator and denominator to put it in simplest form. We can just keep going until we can no longer simplify. So as an example, let's say we see that these two have a 2 in common. 24 divided by 2 is 12. 36 divided by 2 is 18. We can see that they still have a 2 in common since they're both even. 12 divided by 2 is 6. 18 divided by 2 is 9. We can now see that they each have a 3 in common. 6 divided by 3 is 9. 9 divided by 3 is 3. Well, what we divided by was a 2, and a 3, or 12, which we already said was the greatest common factor of these two numbers. So even if we need to do this in steps, we can still figure out what the greatest common factor of the numerator and denominator was. We can use the least common multiple of denominators of two fractions in order to add fractions. As an example, let's consider 1 over 6 plus 3 over 8. So a lot of times we hear people talk about the LCD, the least common denominator. This is exactly the same as the least common multiple. The least common multiple of 6 and 8 is 24. So that's what I need each fraction to turn into. 6 times 4 is 24, so 1 times 4 is 4. 8 times 3 is 24, so 3 times 3 is 9. So total I would get 13 over 24. It's not required to use the least common denominator. We could use any common denominator. If you're unsure what the least common denominator is, you can just multiply the denominators. In this case, 6 times 8 is 48. 6 times 8 is 48, so 1 times 8 is 8. 8 times 6 is 48, so 3 times 6 is 18. Now when I add these, I get 26 over 48. And since we didn't use the least common denominator, our result is not going to be in simplest form, so we do need an additional step. We can see that these both have a 2 in common. And that gives me 13 over 24. So when we use a common denominator that's not the least common multiple of the denominators, the sum will definitely not be in simplest form. However, sometimes, even if we use the least common denominator, it still may not be in simplest form. As an example, let's consider 1/2 plus 1 over 6. Here, my least common multiple is 6. 2 times 3 is 6, so 1 times 3 is 3. And this one already has a 6 on the denominator. That would give us 4 over 6. But 4 over 6 is not in simplest form, even though we use the least common denominator when adding. So essentially, if you don't use the smallest common denominator, the least common denominator when adding fractions, you will definitely have to reduce. And if you do use the least common denominator, there is a possibility of having to reduce.